Good evening, my name is Mateusz Wołkowski. I'm deputy head of the Pilecki-Institut, and I'm glad to welcome you to the discussion on the intellectual ferment in Socialist Europe. This is also where we will be talking with our excellent colleagues on two recently published books. And this is also part of our mission to provide an arena, to provide this intellectual ferment on the subject of 20th century. And I hope you will enjoy this discussion. So many thanks.
Thank you very much. Also from my side, good evening. My name is Susanne Frank. I'm chairing East Slavic Literatures and Cultures at Humboldt University. And tonight, it's my pleasure and honor to moderate the discussion of two brand new books that I would describe as milestones in intellectual history of the 20th century, with regional focus on, in a broader sense, Eastern Europe. The collected volume, Intellectual Production in Socialist Europe, 1956 to 1968, Ideas in Flux, that focuses on a rich and fruitful era of intellectual production when Stalinism was over and could be criticized, and when new ways to refigure the past and discuss the present and the future became open. The volume includes contributions on literature and literary theory, political theory, socialist humanism, socialist cybernetics, and the ecological imaginary from Poland, Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. And this volume just came out with Brill. The second volume is the monograph, Politics, Literature, and Tertium Datur, Socialist Central Europe, which came out with Bloomsbury, London, and focuses on political concepts of literature in the context of two nodal points of European history, 1928 and 1968, in order to compare them. But it also tries to compare those nodal points with the situation of our days, which makes it quite topical. And it is my pleasure to introduce the authors and editors. Una Blagojevic, Alexandra Konaczewska, and Natalia Borisova are the editors of the volume Intellectual Production in Socialist Europe. Una Blagojevic earned her PhD at the Department of Historical Studies at Central European University and is a research assistant at the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj. Her doctoral research focused on intellectual history of Marxist humanism in socialist Yugoslavia. She is broadly interested in the social, cultural, and gender histories of East Central Europe. She is a member of two projects at the moment. One, the ERC project, the history of feminist political thought and women's rights discourses in East Central Europe from 1929 to 2001, hosted at the University of Vienna. And she's a fellow at the project Scaling the Transnational, Entangling Political Imaginaries and Practices in East and West Europe. At the moment, she is research fellow at Ludwig Maximilian University, Munich. Alexandra Konaczewska is postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tübingen. She is a literary scholar and a historian of ideas of East Central Europe. Her book publications include the monograph Gombrowicz, An Introduction, and several collected volumes. One of them titled Unsettled 1968 in the Troubled Present, revisiting the 50 years of discussions from East and Central Europe. Alexandra co-edited an anthology on Stanisław Brzozowski, on his writings in German, a German anthology, Geschichtsmaterialismus als Kulturphilosophie. Currently, Alexandra is working on a DFG project on popular culture, I would say, history-telling, narrating the past in contemporary Polish gonzo literature. Together with Una, Alexandra wrote the introduction to the volume Intellectual Production. Natalia Borisova is a literary scholar with special interests in 19th and 20th century literature. She teaches at the Slavic department of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Tübingen, where she became and is Privatdozentin. Her latest book publications include the monograph With Heart and Eye, Love in Soviet Film and Literature, and her second monograph, which is forthcoming, Making the Self, Teaching Others, Leo Tolstoy, A Story of Self-Perfection. In her article in Intellectual Production, Natalia focuses on two Soviet-Russian writers, Yevgenia Ginzburg and Vasily Aksionov, her son, whose literary works concerned the experience of the gulags. They both questioned the social anthropology through of the new Soviet man through psychoanalytical and or theological concepts. In his contribution to the volume, Bartłomiej Kapica discusses the work of Władysław Bieńkowski, a prominent Polish communist and later a political dissident, and provides an insight into the limits of the post-1956 Marxist revisionism. Bartek, if I may call you like this, it's just easier, earned his PhD at the Department of History at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan. His main interests lie in the history of the communist movement in Poland, the Communist Party apparatus, and the post-war intellectual history. He has completed an internship at La Sapienza in Rome and at the Institute of History of the Polish Academy of Sciences. At present, he is working as an assistant professor at the Center of Totalitarian Studies of the Pilecki-Institut in Warsaw. He is the author of Władysław Bieńkowski, a biography. Ivana Perica also contributed to the volume Intellectual Production in Socialist Europe, where she analyzes the discrepancy between the reformist politics that called for socialism with a human face and literary production in the Czechoslovakia of the Prague Spring. She focuses on the example of Josef Skvorecki's novel The Miracle Game from 1972. And Ivana is the author of the volume Politics, Literature and Tertium Datur. She's working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Leibniz Center for Literary and Cultural Research in Berlin, the ZFL. Previously, Ivana has written and published a lot, but for instance, the private public access of the political, the disagreement between Hannah Arendt and Jacques Rancière. And together with Benjamin Kohlmann, Ivana co-edited the volume, The Political Uses of Literature, Global Perspectives and Theoretical Approaches, 1920 to 2020. The coincidence, so a warm welcome to all of the participants, authors and editors. The coincidence of the release of these two books gives us the unique opportunity to present them together and to discuss the same common key questions and thereby widen the scope historically and include also the period between the wars. Yeah, so Ivana's book starts from 1928. And the collected volume has its focus on the post-war period. Before we start with some more detailed presentations and focusing on some of the contributions, we agreed to start our conversation with a discussion on the term Socialist Europe, which seems to me extremely important because coming from Slavic studies, I appreciate this decision to avoid the word East and Eastern, to get rid of it. But what do you mean by Socialist Europe? Is it just another word for Eastern Bloc? I mean, for the collected volume, we could think, yes, it just replaces this term, but actually it does not. But the question is, what does it include and what does it exclude? So I think you are curious to get to know a bit more about this point.
Yeah, thank you, Susanne, for your kind introduction, and I am very happy as an editor of the volume to answer this question. Indeed, since we focused on this very fascinating period of the symbolic end of totalitarianism in Soviet Union to the symbolic death of legitimacy of Marxism because of the anti-Semitic campaign in Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia. And we wanted to focus on the convergences between East and West. And therefore, this cold logic of Ostblock needed to be abandoned. But then appeared the question, okay, so what all these countries have together, and how to, and where the border, East, West, East Central Europe, Southeastern Europe, how to draw them. And it turns out that when we have this geographical point of departure, then we'll be always unhappy. There is always East Yugoslavia, Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe. But when we say Southeastern Europe, would we say the same of Greece? That is even more East and even more South, and so on. There also appeared the question, when we are abandoning this Cold War logic, then actually more freedom starts. We can include Yugoslavia, we can think of Romania, we can think of Albania as belonging to the same world where state socialism existed and had enormous influence on intellectual and cultural production. So for us it was, we're very happy with finding this term to make it as inclusive as possible. I know, Natalia, you are the Soviet Union expert, so perhaps you can add something to that.
Yes, I would like to add something. Yes, it is a question, on the one side, it is a question of the symbolic geography, so what it is, so how we can call what the name we will choose for what we are describing. But for me, it was also a bit a discursive question, because words change their meanings in different contexts, in different times. And the term of Eastern Europe, it is quite an old, and I think it belongs a bit to this politic mythology of the Cold War. So here's the East and here's the West, yeah? And then in the discussions of in the 80s or 1980s, so before and during the Velvet Revolution in Eastern Europe, I think the term of Eastern Europe has corrupted, so they changed somehow, because it was a time when other terms like Central Europe emerged, yeah, and we have this opposition of this East and Central, yeah, and with Eastern Europe usually. So how I would understand this term now, it is a meaning of this Soviet oppression, of the Soviet colonization come with. So it was not previously the part of the meaning of Eastern Europe, but it is now, yeah? And for me, it was So there is no doubt Soviet oppression in this region. So I think so nobody would doubt it. But I think it is important to not to escape this structure of oppression and protest, but to look for some different approaches to this region. And I think the term of Socialist Europe gave us the possibility to speak in a different way, to see the agencies of this culture, so to see them outside of this violence and victim structure, to see how these cultures react within this Eastern Bloc, within the Socialist Bloc. I think it was why I agree with this term, and I was so happy to found it. Yeah, probably. Una, yeah.
I can also just add from the perspective of Yugoslavia, as somebody who's working on Yugoslav socialism, it doesn't really kind of make sense to talk about Yugoslavia as Eastern Europe already from 48, when Yugoslavia becomes more like independent, breaks with USSR. So like even with the sources are somehow telling you that they did not really see themselves as part of the bloc. So there was already their presence of this sort of diversification of socialist experiences that is exactly Eastern Europe kind of stifles and kind of doesn't allow to emerge. So like with this exactly term Socialist Europe, you know, the Yugoslavian experience, which is kind of different, but also not so different when we look at this period from the death of Stalin on from this sort of revisionism in East Central Europe. So yeah, just to add this point, and I can pass.
Yes, thank you. Yes, thank you also now in my name for the very warm welcome here, and also to Pilecki-Institut. Yes, we were speaking about like Eastern Europe, and also the concept of Central Europe is not less problematic. And I will just add, this is an anecdote from the publishing phase of my monograph, is that I was very unhappy with having Central Europe in the subtitle, but it was kind of suggested to me by the publisher for marketing reasons, which I hated. But then kind of after some back and forth, we agreed to term it Socialist Central Europe. The reason why, I mean, what you just said about Yugoslavia, it has always been, you know, like coming from this part of Europe, it has always, I was aware that, you know, it is, Central Europe very much depends on where you draw the border. And let's say Zagreb is or Zagreb cultural scene would always say, no, we are not Balkans, we are Central Europe. And then Vojvodina is perhaps still Central Europe, but Belgrade, no. So, but it's also, you know, like you have these antagonisms behind with those people who are behind some alleged border. And it's always a question of belonging to some kind of civilized ideal of Europe. I remember that back then when I had this discussion with the publisher, I remember essays by Yugoslav and Croatian author Miroslav Krleža, who always emphasized that his region, which was North Croatia, is region of monkeys, and he always used the Krkavian dialect word for that, which is also Czech and Slovak word opica, meaning that you know, like we are as opicas, we will never belong to that Central Europe. And so I always felt like if I have this in subtitle, I myself am somehow sneaking into the place where I do not belong. But when you use this adjective socialist, then there is no issue that, and especially the authors I'm discussing in this book have made major contributions to a reimagining of Europe by socialist terms. And when we speak of all these regional and in the end also bureaucratic political connotations, we also have to consider that I think most of the authors who are included in both books, in both titles, they stand for some alternative futures that were designed in the past even through the form of criticism, but perhaps were never realized, or were on the way of realizing them, but perhaps never succeeded. So we should also think about, like these paths that were kind of envisioned but never realized, and that would also be a socialist Europe. Yeah.
So maybe just one remark that this region can be also described by a concept of the common imagination, that people who lived in that area, they have very similar values and very similar ideas how the future might look like. One example, the case of the Workers' Council. That was one of the most important things that was rose during the changes in Poland in 1956. They were inspired by the Yugoslavian workers' councils. They were people who traveled to Yugoslavia to learn their experience. So basically, if we use a term Central Europe, we cannot match that experience, yeah? But if we use a term Socialist Europe, then we have a common ground for those people and for and how they imagined what the brighter future, because we are still in the 1956. People have dreams and they try to imagine the brighter future and how that brighter future might look like.
Point of view of today, probably one could say that Socialist Europe is a kind of euphemism. But the two books, actually, they refer to situations when socialism still was full of hope. And maybe this is also a very important aspect. And maybe Ivana, you could a bit elaborate on this concept of nodal points that is important, especially for your book, but also for the collected volume.
Yes, I will try. First, I have to say something about these 2 years, 28 and 68. Speaking of some optimistic perspectives, we commonly today, like theoretical production, today still remembers the events of 68. Particularly in Western Europe, but partly also in Eastern Europe, as the starting point where things were beginning to change for the better. And to me, while doing some archive research and reading, it occurred that year 28 was similarly vibrant period, and that it is somehow forgotten both it was forgotten both by the 68 generation and it is forgotten in contemporary cultural historiography, and especially in literary historiography and in literary theory. I don't have the time to go into all the details, but I realized that it was a turning point as much as the 68. Perhaps one of the reasons why it kind of fell through the guitars of history is that 28 was very much authoritarian, and this was also the time of rising fascism across Europe, and also of rising Soviet influence across Central Europe. But it was also very productive for leftist discussions, both social democratic and communist discussions, and it was like around this year an unbelievable concentration of new magazines, new journals, new organizations, new platforms for leftist thought and leftist literary writing, especially, can be traced. And I decided, like in the book, I'm focusing on how this interwar period was refracted to the lens of 68, how it was forgotten. I'm speaking of an oblivion. And how, especially if we look to this Central European space, what is unfortunately lost are these negotiations or attempts to find unorthodox ways of thinking leftist politics and leftist culture as well, even by authors who decided to remain within the orthodoxy. So that perhaps sounds a bit counterintuitive, but when you look at the discussions, I'm especially focusing literary text, like even Bertolt Brecht's Maßnahme, the measure, can be read through this lens of negotiating and not just imposing social Stalinism, as it is unfortunately commonly read still today. Then I came across some aesthetic discussions in the Berlin leftist journal Die Linkskurve, the Left Turn, and Karl August Wittfogel, who imagined this is like this teleological idea of history, but he imagined the development of the political subject of the proletariat through nodal points, which are not only temporal but also geographical in concept, in the sense that proletariat develops its political self-consciousness through nodal points, through these concentrating points, and then it also connects through these geographical nodal points with other spaces of political acceleration worldwide. Then afterwards I kind of came across Galin Tihanov's reading of May 68 and of the 68 events as a place or historical spot in which, for instance, the legacy of Romanticism and political legacy of Romanticism is reactivated and recalibrated, and he also uses this nodal point. So I kind of, that was my decision to use this concept instead of, let's say, leap year, which is the English translation of German Schaltjahr, which is then mainly focused on 1 year. It happens, like what happened in 1 year, and this is like more what happened around this year, and which can kind of symbolically be traced through 1968 and 1928. And of course, 1956, that's like the blind spot of my book, and I mentioned that in a footnote, because I do touch upon also the events in Hungary. Given that I read some authors who have strong biographical references to Budapest and Hungary, for instance, of course, Georg Lukács, Tertium Datur is actually stolen from him, sort of, and Ervin Schinko, who was like Yugoslav and Hungarian author. And of course, I also mentioned that what happened at the events of '56 in Poland are beyond my horizon, because I could have mastered the language for that purpose, but I don't have the time for that. But I was very happy that we met at the workshop where these blind spots were kind of perspectivized, or were like made visible also from Polish perspective, because '56 is also a very, and that's also another point about, you know, like theorizing and historicizing '68, because '68 in the European, I learned through the research that I should not speak of European West, but of capitalist Europe. Similarly, speak of socialist Europe. So in capitalist Europe, theoretical canon of post '68. The focus is very much on this year, or like on small and on the events around it. But actually, when you look at this reformist striving from the perspective of socialist countries, then you see that it is not what happened in the 60s or late 60s, but it was also what happened in the 50s and even in '48. So there's a long prehistory of this nodal point of '68. Yeah.
Else would like to add something. Otherwise, I have an idea that so what you define as Socialist Europe somehow seems to me the region where literature as a tool of negotiating political ideas was very important, and in some sense still is. So would you agree that with this definition, and then against this background, I think it's very interesting to compare your analytical work in your contributions, because, for instance, Ivana, in her article on Szkorecki, she discusses this very interesting phenomenon that in a situation where there's a quite liberal discussion about reforming socialism, and where literature would have had the opportunity to participate in this discussion, we can observe a development in the opposite direction, a kind of politicization of literature, which in this context has not so much to do with political repression. So it's not so easy to explain. Whereas in the case of Natalia's contribution on authors who were confronted with the Gulag and with completely different situation of repression, it's probably easier to explain why they decided to avoid a direct political discussion, but instead switched to other discourses, like theology or psychoanalytics.
I have to concentrate a bit to think on this topic. I would start with this socialism with human face and the discussion of Marxism in 1968 or previously. So in the Soviet Union, the timing is a bit different because it is the nodal point is, for example, the death of Stalin, and then the this how do you call this? Yes. 20th, what is yes in English? 20th Congress of the Communist Party and so on. I think it is extremely important to think about the history of Marxism in both perspectives, in the perspective of East and West. And I think it is extremely important what Ivana has done with her book, yet to somehow to reinterpret the history of the European Marxism, because it is indeed it is the perspective of this Cold War that the Marxism is here and he is a liberal capitalism. It is not true, actually. So I must think about this a bit provocative saying of Joseph Brodsky, Marxism didn't grow on the banks of the Volga River. Marxism не вырос на берегах Волги. It is an extremely successful European idea, probably ideology, probably successful in the same way like the idea of the European nationalism. It is a kind of this cultural or ideological import here. There's an idea which went then around the world, actually. So it was established by a German thinker, I think mostly in Britain. Marx was, I think, in England at this point as he wrote Capitalism. And it was an extremely impressive and important theory of the 19th century. But my problem with the Marxism is the same, I think, the same problem like my authors, so Evgeny Ginsburg and Vasily Aksionov had with this ideology, actually, because Marxism is an ideology of the 19th century, and it was born within this realm of the positivist philosophy. How to work with Marxism in the 20th century, especially in the second part of the second half of the 20th century, how to explain Holocaust and Gulag with the Marxist ideology. So do the theory of alienation and can it help us to understand what has happened to Europe in the 20th century? And I think that is the point where Vasily Aksyonov and Evgenia Ginsburg started. Yeah? So both came actually from this Marxist background, so especially Ginsburg, who was probably Trotskyist. He denied, but it was really very... but then, after the experience of the Gulag, after the experience of Magadan and the camps, Stalinist camps, she was somehow looking for another language, because Marxism, this language of the Soviet communism probably, wasn't a help for her. And she was looking for a language he could describe what she experienced. He could somehow explain what it was, yeah, and that is the point where they departed from this Marxist Marxist ideology, because either you speak about the binary, binary opposition, so West East, the poor rich, and so on, or the Tertium Datur. Yeah, it is not the instrument for understanding what it happens to Europe and 20th century. And that is why they start to look forward, not with this Tertium Datur or with this opposition, but with the multiple choices. Yeah. So with the religion experience, with the psychoanalytical experience, with everything, with esoteric and philosophic, and so on and so on. Yeah? And that is why I was so interested in those two authors. But I must say, I started a bit later than Ivana. I started there where she is finishing her book, because so my text and my author started to work in the 60s. Yeah? But so they completed the text in the 70s after the catastrophe of the 1968. Yeah, and that was a kind of retraumatization for them, and it put them in the situation where they have to think about what was there as in the Gulag. Yeah, in 1968 it was a kind of this trauma coming back, so it's revolving trauma.
I would also add that I'm very happy that it's exactly Natalia's article that opens our volume as mentioning like Gulag literature and the Gulag experience as one of the most profound impact on cultural and intellectual life in socialist Europe is not to be, this impact is not to be exaggerated. And I consider it's a bit like a memento, that it's nice, that is of course great to discuss socialism and different paths of Marxism, but let's not forget, you know, of what this system brought with itself as a price, and that was the cult of Stalin, that were the gulags, and and even after that, the system was still not a liberal democracy. There was still death penalty, there was censorship, there was many other things that will be considered as not bearable. So yes, as I said, I'm really happy that it was this text that opens and that remains kind of caveat that ideas have consequences, and not always the consequence that we would wish ourselves.
Yes, I just want to follow up on that, because I don't want to leave the impression that when I speak of 28 or 68, or when we mention 56, that these are necessarily like optimistic events or optimistic openings of some or some big hopes by like idealist politicians. Most of the authors I discussed in the book declared either in their literary works or in their memoirs that what they did and what they participated in was politics at bottlenecks, meaning that sometimes it's not about, situation where you're sitting as an author at your table and you make decision in this direction or that direction, but that you are forced, given the circumstances, to make a step, and then you make choices. I have, and I think that's very useful to rethink the political 20th century through that lens as well, because we kind of tend today, when we speak of like political literature, to think Also in terms of accusations and, you know, like to pigeonhole authors by what they did and what they imagined. But most of the authors who were actively involved with different kind of in this case leftist politics, they realized that they sometimes have to speak two languages at the same time, that there is something like there's a lot of unfreedom connected with politics committed to achieving freedom. I have a quote, it's a short quote by Ernst Fischer, Austrian communist, who around 68 became also a participant of the so-called Euro-communist movement, which is also addressed many times in your volume. And he says in his memoirs, when he's thinking of his Stalinist phase from the interwar period, and he authored one significant piece, of course forgotten, called Lenin, which was like staged for the first time in 28 in Vienna. Well, thinking about his Lenin phase and also his the phase when he was silent about Stalinist crimes, he asks himself, are humanism and revolution compatible? Aren't moral scruples an obstacle to every action? And mustn't men of the Seipel type, and Seipel was like a fascist Austrian politician, win? Mustn't men of this type win when it is Hamlet who is on the other side? Isn't it that Seipel's toughness is necessary for a revolutionary, together with that humanity which Otto Bauer represented, Austrian social democrat, but humanity which overcomes the shudder of violence, humanity which dares to shoot? Does that exist? Is it possible? Lenin, question mark. Was he the answer? So, I mean, that I think it's a quite telling quote.
Thank you. So just to also follow up on this discussion about Marxism and like what is also Marxism after, well, different periods, like depending on which context we're talking about, if I could just bring up a bit of part of philosophy and Marxism in the context of Yugoslavia, because what I found very interesting is that exactly after the split with Stalin and this sort of attempt to create some independent road to socialism through self-managing socialism in Yugoslavia, which was in its own actually a very radical criticism of Stalin's practice and Marxist-Leninist theory in Soviet Union, also in Eastern Europe, quote unquote. It already kind of then we can talk about this really synthesis of Marxist, like this very classical Marxist text with different philosophies at the time, like phenomenology, existentialism, also critical theory, that because of this openness of Yugoslavia towards the West and very early sort of translations of all the books in French and German and other languages, it really kind of gave this sort of sense to my actors, let's say like the philosophers around the general praxis that I was focusing on, to even ask what is Marxist philosophy right now, because of course they didn't think that like 19th century Marxist thought is exactly applicable to their socialist realities. They were very often talking at this cultural summer school with Ernst Fischer, like other people from Western Europe, like what can we use the concept of revolution in the same way? Can we talk about proletarian kind of class in the moment where in Western Europe a worker can buy a car and drive a car and kind of doesn't really feel so alienated. So in this sense, I think it really kind of creates this sort of question. Well, it created a question for me after exactly 48 and also especially more around 68, what is Marxism in socialist kind of context? Because this answer was very much kind of a question mark. Thank you.
Bartek?
So maybe just a brief remark about the evolution of Marxist language, because it struck me when I read the writings of Władysław Bieńkowski, but also I have the same impression when I follow the writings of the other Marxist or socialist thinkers in Poland, that the evolution of Marxist language was very profound. In the 1940s, during the Second World War, it was a language of epiphany and language even of inclusion. When after the war, in the years 1945 to 1948, it was a language of modernization and language of forthcoming, everyone hoped, inclusion of the groups that were before excluded from the profits of the capitalists. And when we see, because we spoke before about the focal points, when we see where Marxism arrives in 1956 and after 1956, it's really very peculiar situation, because on the one hand, it is no longer a language of inclusion. On the other hand, it still has this potential to describe how underdeveloped countries can reach their economic potential. And I think this is one of the things that was connected with this illusion after 1956, that even that kind of language failed, that in the context of the socialist countries, Marxism was no longer a useful tool to describe how they should modernize themselves. And the third thing that is hidden is this language of violence, that Marxism proved itself to be a language of violence, and people like Bienkowski, but even other revisionists, they try to rationalize it. They try to use other terms to overcome this experience of violence, and I think this is something that also was a foundation to this death of Marxism, that they really try to overcome this obstacle that Marxism, that in 1940s it promised the inclusion, it brought violence, and they didn't find a solution. I would elaborate on that later. That's right now, I just want to mark it.
If there is no further comment on this point, maybe it's also a question to Bartek, but also to the others. I would like to come back to the Socialist Europe concept and ask about the role of exile in this context. So not where are the borders in the West or in the East, but about the role of exile. And in case of your hero, Bienkowski, exile plays a very crucial role in the context of the publication with Gedroids in Paris. And maybe we could take this an example and think about exile. Natalia already mentioned Brodsky, so maybe it could be interesting to reflect on this point a bit.
Yeah, it's also very interesting when we think about the meaning of exile, because there were very numerous ways to be exiled in the socialist.
Exactly, Gulag is also exile.
Yeah, and when we look at the biography of Bienkowski, we can see that you could be exiled and non-exiled in the same period, because, for example, and this was also one of the reasons why I thought his biography is worth studying, that he combined this intellectual independence with, to some extent, his political position. And in one moment, it was the beginning of the 1960s, he was politically exiled, but intellectually still, he was in the very center of the debate, and I thought it was very fascinating. And but the problem was that in the reality of Gomułka's Poland, but also I believe in other socialist countries at that time, that it was a slippery slope. If you were politically exiled, you couldn't take part in the official ideas exchange for a longer period of time. That there was a price that you needed to pay for your intellectual independent position, and Bienkowski, I think, tried, and he did, brought the final point to this evolution, that he didn't stop in the middle. He went further and published in Cultura in Paris, which in the lenses of the communist regime in Poland was a treason. And it also constructed another paradox, that he believed that the impulse to change the situation in Poland could only be produced within the Communist Party, but he was surrounded by the hostile forces to that extent that the only way to express his ideas was to side with people who were perceived as traitors. So I think it is one of the most striking paradoxes of the communist regime at that time, and it also constructs another meaning of being in exile.
Yeah, and thank you for mentioning this notion of exile, and how Eastern European cultures and intellectual production flourished because of the experience of exile and migration, like since 19th century, when we think of Russian or Polish intellectuals who just sit in Dresden or Paris, and then instead of like melting in the local intellectual life, they just still discussing the stuff that was important in Warsaw, in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, as if they weren't in France or in Switzerland or in Germany. And I think this tendency has a really long durée, like a very long tradition. And when we think of discussion between Milan Kundera and Brodsky, like the one sits in Paris, the other sits in New York, and Brodsky doesn't discuss with Edward Said, for instance, who lives in the same city, teaches at Columbia, but no, Brodsky is offended by Czech author who lives in Paris. So I think this is another thing that can be considered as a facet that Eastern Europeans, Slavs, the people of this other Europe have in common, that we can live anywhere, but the problems that we keep in heart are always with us.
Just maybe one thing that also it meant that some of the discussions that we are right now concentrating on were not as purely judged and perceived by other people who were in exile at that time as we perceive them now. For example, Polish Marxist revisionists that were very active in the late 1950s and at the beginning of the 1960s were perceived by the Polish exiles, not only the right-wing independent circles of London, but also more liberal circles connected with Cultura, as strictly politically motivated. They didn't see much intellectual truthness in these discussions, and it struck me very much when I, for example, followed the letter exchanges of Giedroyć and Miroszewski. I don't even mention other figures who were connected with Radio Free Europe. They all have this one thing in common, that is there any political way to use those discussions? Only political.
Yes, I I was reminded of when you said about possibility of reforming Communist Party from within in Poland. In Czech Republic, it was I don't know if I can say comparably, or it was similar, but. It is said that it is being said that the most progressive force in Czechoslovak society at the time, at the end of the 60s, was the Communist Party, and there were strong initiatives to reform the party from within. But there were also different currents, and the one that was, as one of the historians says, a bit too radical, in the sense that they asked for too much freedom. That's that current one, and that was kind of too much from the Soviet perspective. I was reminded of this argument when the war in Ukraine started, this metaphor of being punished for asking too much, all of at the same time. Anyway, the question of exile, from speaking from Yugoslav perspective, Yugoslavia had only one dissident, and that was Milovan Đilas, the famous one. And the reason why Yugoslavia didn't have more dissidents is not that only, or not because it was more liberal, but because exile is also something you can construct, and you need international institutions who accept exiles and make them into exiles. And for Yugoslav intellectuals who disagreed with Communist Party or the Savez Komunista, the League of the Communists, there simply was not that kind of audience in the West, meaning that Yugoslavia, because it had this intermediary position, wasn't Eastern enough from the Western perspective. So there was no interest in producing too many dissidents from that country. But I want to come back to also these interwar exiles, because this is also something which is, like when we speak of exile, we focus exclusively on Cold War and geopolitical interests connected to that. But if you look at the interwar period, like this whole Central European space was producing like so many exiles, because intellectuals and political activists were running, or they were banned from their countries. So hotspots of exile were actually Vienna and afterwards Prague. Both cities accepted many banned authors and intellectuals and activists from what was first Yugoslavia, from post-revolutionary Hungary, and even Lukács, who spent 10 years in Vienna, had to leave Vienna at some moment. So. These cities of exile, centers of exile in the interwar period, were at the same time strongholds, or or workshops of dissident thinking of that time, where people did not only come to, but where they connected, where these networks were established and made stronger. So these are not only places where they ran to, but this is also where they were like their meccas, of political dissidency, where then after some period, when they were able to come back to their home cities or travel further, they were kind of immunized or empowered by additional thinking or additional networks, or etc.
I think this is a very important point that makes clear that we have to differentiate between, we don't have to talk only about continuity of this socialist Europe, but to differentiate between those periods, because in the interwar period, exile, I think, is something completely different than in the Cold War period, and also the centers of in East Central Europe of exile are, as you said, hubs, meeting points of exiles, but people on the move, from there, and here and there, and so very dynamic centers and communication between the countries and the centers were completely different and much more intense than afterwards. Natalia, you wanted to contribute to this?
Just a small contribution, probably to the center, to this exile topic. Yeah, there's centers of exile in the interwar periods. So another center was Moscow, actually. Yeah, but I'm not sure that it was a fruitful workshop place. So probably at the beginning of the 30s, yes, but by the end of the 30s, definitely not. Yeah, and for the question of exiles, so in the period after the war, it is interesting that so Soviet dissident or so more or less dissident, so they all left Soviet Union more or less for the same purpose. So for the disagreement with the Soviet ideology, the Soviet state, and so on, and so on. But the trajectories of them in the exile so were completely different. So like Alexander Solzhenitsyn developed himself in the direction of the extremely nationalism, anti-Semitism, and so on. Then we have, for example, the example of Eduard Limonov, who left Soviet Union, so like I don't know whether he was a political dissident, but aesthetical dissident, yeah. And then there's a, and then he landed in the National Bolshevik Party. I don't know what is the connection of the National Bolshevik Party to a Marxist ideology, and whether it is some, yeah. But it is more or less a leftist party. So he somehow established himself in this way, yeah. And when we look to the examples of Joseph Brodsky, or Vasily Aksionov, who was also exiled here, so we will see extremely successful careers abroad, yeah. Both. They published in English, so Brodsky got this Nobel Prize. Aksionov was a quite a successful writer. He could publish a lot. And what's interesting is he managed a furious comeback to the post-Soviet Russia, yeah? And he became extremely popular in this post-Soviet Russia. And I think it is this possibility of this pathetic possibility of changing himself. With Joseph Brodsky and extremely with Vasily Aksionov, who always somehow changed his skin, yeah. So he started as a Soviet writer of this young generation, so the proper Soviet young man, and then he changed to the position of his mother, of a critic of the Stalinist Soviet Union, and then he went to USA and became a kind of capitalist writer, and he worked sometimes for this Radio Freedom, and then he came back and he became a most commercially successful writer, I think, in the 90s, so in the post-Soviet Russia. And that is interesting to trace the so the ways, the careers, how they start, and how this possibility of change. Yeah, so this somehow, so always on time, so always, so in the first row. Yeah.
Yeah, super interesting. But couldn't we say that Aksionov and Brodsky say somehow, and also Solzhenitsyn and Limonov, they somehow continued the Russian tradition of westernizers and Slavophiles, in a sense, maybe, but you brought in the aspect of national context and national tradition, which wasn't present so far in our discussion, but in the background is somehow still important. So maybe somebody would like to contribute on this aspect. I'm not so sure about Yugoslavia.
I can start if nobody. So the national aspect, I mean, this idea of national road to socialism, this was also part of our book, and this is a topic that is also found, obviously has to be mentioned, as you said. And with Yugoslavia, like, there are so many literature exactly from this period after the split with Stalin that Yugoslavia started this sort of like national road to socialism with its specific path to socialism, so socialist self-management. So it has always been around. Tito was accused as the nationalist revisionist by the Soviet Union, and so on. But for example, from my perspective, again, like going from my own research, and this is somehow connected with interwar period, which I don't know much about, but I could always see that there was this, especially about in this period of like Marxist revisionism and in this move away from Marxist-Leninist interpretations that are from the Soviet Union, that these intellectuals, philosophers, sociologists as well, but like different intellectuals in the region were really trying to kind of historicize their socialist and Marxist practice or theory by going back to the local national context and to try to find some sort of, be it social democrat or some sort of democratic interpretations of something like leftist traditions. And this is found everywhere in the region, in Czechoslovakia, in Yugoslavia, in Poland, with the guys, mainly guys that I was working with, the Praxis Marxists in Yugoslavia. This is actually something very interesting because they didn't really go back to these national traditions that are found in Yugoslavia, and they did have lots of possibilities like Krleža and others, and this is something that kind of creates this sort of more Western understanding and Western connections with Marxist thought, more interpretations, like more mixing this Marxist theory with, as I was mentioning and repeating myself now, existentialism and reading Heidegger, Sartre, and so on. So I think this is a very interesting question, very important to talk to, and I will pass my pass it to Ivana.
I wonder. National question, like there is this general idea that one of the errors of Marxism was ignoring national and nation and nationalism on the one hand, and also that it was not like the 19th century canon was not, which was focused on industrial proletariat, was not apt to or not fitting to agrarian countries, which were more or less, except for most developed Czechs, most in so-called Eastern Europe, but. It is amazing when you debunk these, when you go to the discussions also from the interwar period, that national question has been discussed as one of like real political questions and real political problems. I didn't go into that in much detail, but I remember that August Cesarec had, who is completely non-translated but great. Unorthodox Orthodox Marxist from the interwar period, murdered by Ustašas in 1941 in Zagreb. He had essays on the national question in Yugoslavia, not from nationalist perspective, of course, but from the perspective of, let's say, real politics on the left. How do you reach people who have already been shaped by the national idea? Or do you practice some kind of pure Marxism, revolutionary Marxism, totally ignorant of this idea? Or do you kind of make some kind of compromises and reach out to them for some, like with some thought through efforts, let's say. So that is what comes across my mind at this moment. Yeah. It was a question of tactics. Let's say in the end.
No, if you want.
Actually, I mentioned it not national so perspective, but nationalist. Yeah, so explicitly with Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Eduard Limonov, and I think it is one of the effects and or results of diminishing of the influence of Marxism, of course. Yeah, and that is what so what is the next step here? It just
I think there are several aspects that can be mentioned when we speak about nationality, nationalism, and Marxism. One of them is, I feel that some wise and profound Marxist thinkers after 1956, they very quickly realized that by using the Marxist language, they cannot establish a link with society. This was one of the aspects that alienated them, and I think it's very funny, because when we think about official reasons why those people who returned to power in 1956, why they were persecuted in the 1948, because they tried to implement these national aspects of language into the Marxist landscape. Of course, that was done in the disguise. In the Polish case, they appealed to the tradition of the Polish Socialist Party that was independent, that was before 1939, was a party that was in opposition to the communists. And when they returned to power in 1956, they claimed very broadly that they would like to introduce finally this national way of communism, but they had this problem how to define it. There are some documents that describe one of the visits of Bieńkowski in London. It was 1957, and I think they are very important to understand troubles they had, because he was confronted with the journalists and experts from the West to explain how he imagined this new national way to communism, and he was forced to use some of the mimics that he would like to establish communists on the earth, not on the moon, something like that. But he couldn't, define very concrete ways how this new national communism would look like. So basically, that was a matter of tradition that was broken in a very violent way in 1948. On the other hand, I think it was also a result of very practical thinking, that they realized the limits of the pure Marxist language, so they needed to invent themselves. And I can be very mean and say that was the very communist way, because one of the phrases that was used in the communist apparatus was the knowledge of the face. And that was one of those moments that they needed to implement that term.
Yeah, I want also thank you for this question about nationalism, because this is the aspect that I think in Polish context is rarely discussed, that the communists after the war managed to do things that we rather think of a fascist force, like the ethnic cleansing of over 100,000 of Ukrainians, Lemkos and Boykos. Like that, some people say that it was in fact a cultural genocide of Lemkos and Boykos culture. So like this minorities question, and then of course the big event of March '68. And I have an impression that many of like this first generation of anti-communists became anti-communists because they were deep anti-nationalists, and this nationalist rhetoric and this homogeneous brutal way of implementing that we are in unity, both in like materially and spiritually, was something that that scared them and put them, like, also for aesthetical reasons, away. And this is something that didn't appear in our book. We rather concentrate on this nice revisionist approach. But I think this is something that it's for the future worth further investigation, especially in context exactly this attitude towards minorities, and from the point of view perhaps post-colonial studies, the colonial, and you know how grown narratives like socialism, Marxism brutally persecuted them.
Just one add-on. Yeah, because right now I feel very tired of doing analysis of the communist, Marxist, humanist. So I switched to the socialist humanists. And one of them, Jan Strzelecki, he wrote in 1946 a very important text that is called Socialist Humanism. And he touches upon the aspect of nationalism. I think it is very important to note that this notion of socialist humanism was attacked very brutally by the Communist Party and was eventually discarded. But what Strzelecki writes, he writes that during the Second World War, when terror and violence were everywhere, and one could lose its life within a second, they realized, he and his peers, that the only circle in which human being belongs to is the nation, but not in a way the nationalists think, but in the way that there are people who are around us and they speak the same language and they belong to the same culture. And if a human being wants to reach beyond itself, it needs to engage with them. And this was a very soft way to overcome the limits of nationalism seen as a theory of exclusion. Strzelecki produced that with this text, nationalist and socialist theory of inclusion, and it was very brutally attacked by the Communist Party. So this is also one of the approaches that I think we should mention.
I think this is a wonderful concluding statement, and because, I mean, now you brought in, I also wanted to bring in this term of socialist humanism. And I think there's a great potential to continue the discussion on this term, because somehow also you can read it in several contributions how ambiguous this term actually is, because on the one hand it served in order to legitimize official communism, and on the other hand by this term many authors try to revise socialism. And actually, as for me, I came across this term in the context of Soviet literature of the 1970s to 70s, 80s. Chingiz Aitmatov, the Kyrgyz author, is one who makes use of this term in the context of Helsinki and after Helsinki, to explain a specific universalist position that somehow is in line with the official Soviet position, but tries to find a compromise somehow. And yeah, so this would be from a already not Central European point of view. But also, I mean, with nationalism and socialist communism, we reached a point where it's important to think of the topicality of your topic, because this problematics of nationalism on the one hand and universalism on the other is very important for our days as well. And I think this is the moment where we can open the discussion and ask for your questions and statements. There are experts on...
Maybe I'm not enough.
It's recorded. But,
so I still don't understand the relationship between Marxism and Leninism, because I think there is no Marxist ideology, but there is Leninist ideology that became then reified under Stalin, and there's a Marxist critique of ideology rooted in the left Hegelian tradition created by Marx. And I think we see this difference in Lukács himself, who started as this left Hegelian in the tradition of Marx and then became a Leninist. If we think of the reification essay, for example, which became very central to the critical theory. So how do your authors actually deal with this overforming of Marxist philosophy or Marxist critique of ideology through Lenin?
I see some other experts on Lukács as well, who maybe also want to contribute to this discussion.
I mean, I didn't get the first part of the question. If you can just also without the microphone repeat that.
The relationship between Marxism and Leninism, which
Mm-hmm.
was in a way conflated in a discussion over and over again. And I mean, Una already hinted at it, that there is in the Yugoslav case, like authors who very much detach themselves voluntarily from this Leninist tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the other cases discussed here? Because you talked of Marxist ideology, and I still don't have a clue what you mean, especially if you have someone like Lukács, who became so central for the entire Western Marxist tradition of critical theory.
Mm-hmm.
Which is completely different, of course. I mean, Adorno and Horkheimer were also Marxists, and they could not be farther away from someone like Lenin or Stalin.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, that's one of the central problems of this interwar period, and it escalates as to actually around 28, when and you know, like this turn to this Marxism and not Leninism. That was also, there were also proposals. It was also kind of related to discovery of Frühschriften, of his early work. It's interesting to see, like for me, for my research, that proposals for this kind of let's say reformed Marxism, or this kind of Tertium Datur avant-la-lettre, were also given in early 20s even, or like towards the end of the 20s. But same as with Lukács himself, this was discarded as non-revolutionary and reactionary politics. And I think we should not because I'm reading literary texts, and we should not discard these texts because they kind of are in a way affirmative of Lenin. I mentioned this play by Ernst Fischer, and there is another wonderful Stalinist piece, I must say, really well written, about Tito, the big traitor, written by Ernst Fischer, Das große Verrat, from I forgot the year, but from the 50s, which is not on the Leninist but on the Stalinist line. We should not treat these, when you speak of literary approaches, we should look more carefully at these texts and then look for moments where the texts themselves open the discussion. And when you look at these texts, then you see that this question of, you know, like Leninism or some more soft Marxism has been discussed as early as in mid-20s or in late 20s. So that's what kind of I learned from my analysis of literary texts. So it's not something which comes up, you know, like with turn to early Lukács or early Marx in the 60s.
I would affirm this also in terms of theory, but I think that Lukács became a Marxist at the very same moment he became a Leninist, and you can't distinguish between the Leninism and the Marxism in Lukács. He became a Marxist because he wanted to have a political theory that is that he can implement politically. It was not about it that he was first he was a pure Marxist and then he became somewhat corrupted as a Leninist. He was a Leninist from the very beginning, and this is one of the things that he never changed. There are these rapid changes in his career, and he doesn't want to. He does not affirm anything before these changes, and then he says the author of. He talks of himself in the third person. But one of the things that he never changes is his love for Goethe, his love for Thomas Mann, and his love for Lenin till the very end. And I think this is something that you have to acknowledge. And I think this is something also that is interesting in this. Many of these, maybe it's different in this Yugoslavian school when they. But I think this Leninism is a very stable thing in many of these theories. And they did rather distinguish between Lenin and Stalin than between Lenin and Marx.
And I want to add something else. The question of Leninism was in the 20s also a question of revolutionary tactics. So when you apply this to literary text, then you have or like the social functions of literature. Then you have always the question of how to open up some problems by raising questions on the one hand, and how to stay on the revolutionary line. How to be with the party, but also be able to be against it. So actually, this is the dynamics, or this is the tension that has been there from the start, I would say.
Are there other questions or comments? If not. If not, then thank you for coming and listening to us, and thank you for the discussion, for the wonderful discussion. And I think after this discussion you will get more readers, hopefully. Yeah, thank you.